Okay, I'm
And
recording. Here we go.
very nice to meet you, Nick MacWilliam, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Yes, nice to meet you too,
And
Paula.
you and you are a filmmaker, obviously, and we are today speaking because your film, Santiago Rising, is part of Cine+Mas San Francisco Latino Film Festival.
Yeah, it is.
Um,
Fantastic
yes,
news.
yes, and I will definitely be getting the word out about your film and the festival as much as I can to my network through Chile Lindo. And it's really very nice meeting you. I saw the film, obviously, and I also, but first, is your background in film? I'm sorry that I didn't get a chance to really research enough.
No problem.
How are you a filmmaker? I imagine before you came
So,
upon the
well, no. Santiago Rising is my first feature documentary. I've made a couple of shorter things, but this is my first kind of proper one. It is, was a big effort to make. But I do have a background in journalism, especially around Latin America. I lived for a number of years in Chile and a little bit in Argentina, where among other things I did journalism. And in recent years, I've traveled to mainly Colombia quite regularly. And I've done quite a bit of journalism around Colombia. So those three countries, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, I've spent quite a lot of time in. And yeah.
I understand you lived in Chile between 2010 and 2014?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And what first drove you to that country so far away at the end of the
yeah.
America?
So you'll probably get from my accent that I'm from the UK. I'm
Yes.
from London. And I moved. Well, I mean, I was just at a period of my life where I was single. I wasn't really doing a job that interested me, and it was just a time in my life where I wanted to do something different, And I got the opportunity to go to Chile. Initially, just as a teacher, but I also wanted to learn Spanish. And I mean, I spoke Spanish because I lived in Spain for a bit, but just to like a kind of a okay level, not that great. And I'd never actually been to South America, and I heard what a beautiful place Chile was, obviously, and I knew a little bit of the political history, the dictatorship of Pinochet and the Allende government, but I wasn't, I wasn't as an expert on Chile or anything, I just moved there because
it takes living in a place. It really, you don't get that academically.
Absolutely,
you have
absolutely.
to really live in a place to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went there and I went for a year, but I just loved it, and ended up staying for 4 years. I mean, it's of course it's a beautiful country. Everyone knows that. The landscape is incredible. Very few places on earth are as spectacular as that. But living there, I got really into. Cause I lived in Santiago, right? Which isn't, if you've been, it's not like Buenos Aires or Mexico, DF. It's like. It's cool, but it's not somewhere that on the surface is immediately grabs you, if you go as a visitor. But when you spend some time there, you get to find there's a really, really interesting cultural scene, a lot of really good music, filmmaking, literature, theatre. And, I'm from London, which is like a cultural capital of the world. But the thing is, in London, it's really established, Obviously, you get different levels, but in Santiago, I always felt like there was a real, emerging, blossoming aspects of culture. And often that was tied to social issues, political issues. And I guess that's, and I lived there the more I lived there, the more I realized that this was like a tradition in Chile, that these kinds of issues have always been addressed through music, through street art, through theatre, through poetry. I just became kind of
through poetry.
Yeah,
it's called a country of poets.
It absolutely is, of course, and it has this incredible tradition, an incredible oral literary tradition, and also a long tradition of people's movements, social movements. I mean, of course, all of Latin America does. So living in Chile was like a really incredible experience, you know. And
well, I definitely call it a country of firsts because it really has, you know, the first that elected a socialist.
Yeah, it certainly was. Yeah,
Democratically, the first that actually transitioned out of a out of a dictatorship via a democratic um, movement, and now this enormous movement led by youth primarily that wants to basically say, no, this system of growth, and neoliberalism isn't working, and we're going to change it. And that's where we're at right now, with elections coming up for a new president, where there's a candidate that's only 34 years old, and there's a woman candidate. And so when you arrived in Chile, I wonder, as someone that is looking from the outside, if it didn't surprise you how many of the issues that are so much part of the major cities around the world, where we see the fight for indigenous rights, the feminist movement taking on a total new dimension, LGBT, gay rights, cannabis, global warming. Were you surprised to find that in Chile, that is so much part of the younger generation in terms of what they're looking for in their future?
Yeah, well, I found the younger generation in Chile to be very radical, you know. Like, I moved there in 2010, so that's exactly 20 years after the dictatorship ended. And that means that the people who'd been born just after the dictatorship were now just arriving in adulthood, you know. And this became really apparent in 2011, when Chile had an immense student uprising. And this was just one of many movements that was taking place in the country, but the student movement was particularly intense, you know, and it basically shut down education in the country for 7 or 8 months. And the students were occupying, they basically took over the universities, the schools, and they were running them themselves. And they were putting on their own classes, and they were having community meetings, and they were doing arts, and culture became a massive part of that. And all of that movement was in response to the neoliberalized, highly unequal, privatized educational model which had been imposed in Chile through the Pinochet dictatorship.
Right.
So
exactly.
what I was not perhaps so anticipating when I moved to Chile was just how kind of prevalent the dictatorship still was in daily life, you know, whether that's the health system, the education system, environmental issues, the you know, poor labor conditions. All of these can be traced back to, well, of course, some of them can be traced back a long time in Chilean history. But then, you know, with the election in 1970 of Salvador Allende, there was a real effort, a democratic effort by the people to build a fairer society, you know, to redistribute some of the wealth, some of the land which had been kind of concentrated in a very privileged elite. And obviously that was unacceptable to those elites, you know, and also to the United States, to Britain, a lot of the capitalist powers, the wealthiest.
Oh, sure. It was at the peak of the Cold War, and copper. Exactly. Copper was the big, you know, the main export of Chile back then, especially. And
Britain has always had a very key role.
Chilean copper.
I said Britain has always had a very had deep interests in Chile's copper production, going back to the 19th century. Yeah. So
yeah, the British Railroad, and it goes back to nitrate, which is a history that we see repeated worldwide, where natural resources become a country becomes so dependent, and the entire society functions in terms of which ironically is happening in the United States as well, as we know. But Chile became the experiment of neoliberalism,
the neoliberal laboratory,
and all this. So this is the backlash, and there is definitely still so many that lived the Allende years and lived the dictatorship and now are seeing this, where there's a second opportunity to really say, you know, this is not the society we want for Chile.
Yeah.
This is what we've been fighting against, or, you know, although I have to say that it's interesting the way Chile swings from socialist to right wing back to, so we saw that with Piñera, Bachelet, and you know,
yeah.
And however, there seems to be that this movement that we're seeing in Chile is really connected with an entire generation, where we're seeing it worldwide as well, and for many of the issues and many of the changes they want to see. But going back to your film, which is why we're here, clearly you were very in touch with many of the people that are at the forefront of this social changes, such as Cinearte Alameda, Rosefort, that I know personally.
Okay, great.
And you had the opportunity to interview members of Inti Gimani. I remember when her theater, when Cinearte, which was the only place in Santiago, because Chile still has a very provincial, Catholic, conservative side to it that dominates the culture, in contrast with this highly progressive young people. And at Cinearte Alameda, that was the only place really where you saw, you know, very, very creative groups experimenting in film and in shows as well, you know, live shows and music. And Rosefort has brought all this to the forefront and allowed a space for this. And as you show in the film, this was the place also that they were helping La Primera Línea and a lot of people that were hit by the guanacos and that were
and it's, of course, it's right. It's right by the epicenter of the protests as well. You know, it's only maybe a couple of 100 yards away from like the main plaza. So, you know, it was always on the forefront. You know, and it became partly because it has a culture and a history and a tradition of resistance through cultural expression. You know, when I lived in Chile, I went to see a lot of films, a lot of documentaries, but also a lot of music there. And it was often, as the guy says, Gustavo, who works in the cinema, he says in my film, you know, he says this is a place which has always had a political and social edge to its cultural output. Exactly. And so when the social explosion began, it was, you know, I mean, it was, doesn't surprise me that it became such an important place for solidarity, but also for like medical support, man, because the police were out of control. You know, they were out of control and they were just attacking people left, right, and center. So you needed to have these places in the immediate vicinity where people could go to receive sanctuary, you know. And the building of the University of Chile Student Federation was another similar place where they were receiving a lot of people who'd been hurt in the protests, you know, and in the repression. So that was a really important part of the film for me to get.
Yes, the response to the protests, you can definitely see that the DNA of the Pinochet years,
absolutely,
in the police force and in the armed forces is still.
They still revere Pinochet.
I mean, it just like ignited right back. It didn't take too much.
I mean, the uniforms are still the same, you know. The uniforms are still the same. There's been no reform to Chilean police, to the Chilean military after what they did, you know, because Pinochet kind of stepped down from the, you know, the head of state role that he had. He stepped down. So he was, it was in a referendum, but it was a peaceful referendum, and it was, you know, it was negotiated, and the outgoing dictatorship was able to determine the means, you know, the conditions for that transition back to so-called democratic governments. So there was complete impunity. Hardly anything was changed. The economic system that Pinochet put in place was left untouched. So that meant the environmental or the anti-environmental laws, the anti-trade union laws, the anti-terrorist law, which is applied almost uniquely to indigenous protests in Chile. All of these were created under the dictatorship, but then when as I say, the so-called democratic governments came back in the 1990s, a lot of them thought that actually this system works for us because it does control Chilean workers. It does control to an extent. It does make it more difficult for people to challenge the system, and that is like what you see today. Is a legacy of that, and there's almost, there's almost as much anger.
And it was protected by the Constitution, because
it was protected by the Constitution, which is why
it was not changed, and the police force and the armed forces were not reformed.
They were not reformed.
And I think that was probably a huge lack of vision and lack of understanding of really how important a deep transition was, so that the country really did move forward in a way. But I think that many on the other side would say, but it was working economically, because Chile went from the shanty towns that existed in the 70s to housing projects, but nonetheless privatized education and privatized the medical system, and an overall system where everyone is in debt, that didn't really build the country from the bottom up. And recently they showed the Battle of Chile. Are you familiar with the Battle of Chile?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive influence on my film. I mean, I don't claim my film is anywhere near the Battle of Chile, but it's a huge influence. It's a huge influence on all my knowledge of Chile, and it's a masterpiece. It's one of the most important films of all time.
I agree with you, and I think it's studied in many universities in film classes, but it was shown recently for the first time.
Yes, I know. I followed that story. I followed that story, and the backlash, the attempts to shut it down.
It really opened people's eyes to that had no idea, that they just thought that Salvador Allende was just a bunch of terrorists that were selling, that were going to be manipulated by the communists. One of the comments that I kept reading that came out of people that saw the Battle of Chile, and that had been, all of a sudden, it's like their eyes opened to what really had happened between 1970 and 1973. And they were so surprised at how well spoken, how educated the entire movement was, from the labor movement to the professors, because really Chile had an enormous middle class that was very well educated and very well prepared, that landed a democratically elected socialist president, not out of necessity from it being a revolution that had to fight through, the way we had the Cuban Revolution, but one that grew out of intellectuals and professors and nurses and labor movements that said, why does our copper belong to Anaconda,
Absolutely.
And this is what I think people saw for the first time in the Battle of Chile. And I saw your narration was just wonderful. I love the way you narrate in that film, just enough to give people, the historical perspective, and carry the historical context from one shot to another, that includes the culture, like Anita Tijoux, that I have also been following her career, that was the daughter from exiles in France
Yeah.
that went back to Chile, and she has become a creative, artistic voice that you must have heard and learned about by being there. Because while I was looking at the film, I'm like, Nick knows many people that are key in the cultural and in the movement that would be difficult for someone coming from outside just to film this El Estallido Social, you know? So clearly you were very connected with a lot of the
I mean, I couldn't have made this film without having lived in the country, you know? I mean, there's a lot, the film moves quite fast, particularly in the first half, because there's just so much ground to cover, you know? I needed to give the historical context. I needed to give like the actual facts of the Estallido, what's happened. But then I had to track all the different social movements which are participating, you know? So that was the feminist movement, the Mapuche movement, the student movement, the victims of the dictatorship, you know, and then there was the independent press, the independent media outlet, which you know, we can't overstate the importance of independent media and grassroots journalists in Chile, not just today in the Estallido, but going back to the days of Pinochet as well, you know. And you could include Patricio Guzman, who made the Battle of Chile. You could include him in that, you know, because these are the people who risked a lot to get that information out to the world. And you know, the history of Chile has been determined, or you know, the common understanding of the history of Chile has been determined in a large part thanks to the work of people on the ground documenting what was taking place, often at terrible risk to themselves. You know, Guzman's cinematographer, his cameraman, and his partner, Jorge Muller, and sorry, I forget his Jorge Muller's partner's name, but they were both disappeared, you know, and the footage in Battle of Chile had to be smuggled out of the country, you know. So whoever smuggled that footage out of the country took a great risk to do that, because they obviously recognized the importance.
Patricio Guzman talked about that because the footage was in his father's home, and it was smuggled out. It was going to leave the country. I believe it may have been the Swedish embassy.
Okay.
However, like a diplomatic, you know, package, you might say, and it was in a trunk, and they still had to get it nonetheless from Santiago to Valparaiso. And they were able to get that footage across only days after the coup, all across, which back then it was probably a good 2-hour drive between Santiago and Valparaiso, in the back of, I think, a Citroneta or something like that, going through all the stops. And then it made it to Valparaiso, and then they said valija diplomática, you know.
Yeah.
And I think it must have been someone from the Navy, that it was his decision whether to open it or not. But actually, because it was diplomatic, it was through the diplomatic channels, they were not allowed to open it, period. So they went back and forth about whether open it, no, don't open it, open it, don't open it. And finally he said, send it without opening it. And that is how all of that film made it to Europe. And when I heard the story, I could not believe, because you couldn't get a block away, you know, without being searched. And how that's when I say that's divine intervention in a way, or something much bigger, much greater, that allows for something like that to happen in 1970 months, maybe not even, after the coup. September 11, 1973, which I happened to be in Chile. I was born in New York, but my parents are from Chile.
Okay.
And I was living with my grandparents in Chile.
Okay.
During the Allende years and during the coup.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you like the film, Paula, because for me, the most important thing is that that Chileans and people who have been directly impacted by the issues in the film, that they recognize it as something that it's my small contribution to la memoria histórica.
No, absolutely.
And I really appreciate that Chileans like it, because the reaction in Chile has been very positive, and that means so much to me.
Yes, especially that this is a document that now really is permanent. It's like you can go back and see the heart of what has led this movement that is continuing, because now the Constitution is being rewritten, and the changes that so many have fought for are actually, we are seeing them take place. What I would ask you is where have you shown the film?
Well, mainly here in the UK. Actually on Sunday, so it was that 3 days ago, the cinema near where I live. It was the first time I ever showed it in a cinema. So, to an actual audience, because of COVID, of course. So that was a really big moment for me. So before that, it had all been online screenings.
And you show, when did you finish the film?
Well, we released it in January. So we did a load of screenings then online, and we've also done a few screenings for Chile. Because there's two versions, because obviously most of the film is in Spanish, but my voiceover is in English. So there's an English version for an English audience where, my voiceover is not translated, but all of the obviously the Spanish in the film is subtitled. And then the Spanish version where it's just my voiceover, which is subtitled, and a couple of other moments because it's not really needed. So yeah, we've done a few Chilean screenings, and we took a decision that we would never sell tickets in Chile. We would always make it freely available for people to watch in Chile. So
has Rutherford, does she have this screen?
I sent it to the guys. That I don't have Rose's contacts, but I do have the contacts of a couple of other people there, and I can give it to you.
I can give it to you because she is just starting to screen films. In fact.
Okay, cool.
I not at Cine Arte Alameda, because that's been destroyed still. She's taking it out to different on different venues, and she's actually showing films. Did Chileans go to the opening on Sunday? Did they get to hear that?
I recently moved out of London because London's just a bit too expensive, and working. But I did a Q&A, and there's a local. I'm living in a small town on the coast now, so it's not that big. It's quite a small place. It's a cool place, but it's a small place. But a good friend of mine, who is also herself the daughter of Chilean political exiles, she was born in Chile, but she grew up in Scotland. She lives here, so she joined me on stage for a discussion after the film. And there was a couple of other Chileans in the audience, but there's not many Chileans here, but we've got screenings all over the UK in the next couple of months. Well, really in the next month, actually. And we'll definitely be getting a lot of Chileans to those because they're in bigger cities, and that's where a lot of people tend to be, especially, because a lot of the Chileans who come here, there's a lot of young people who come here to study or to work. And then there's an older generation. But we've had a lot of...
But I'm sure your audience remembered the coup and the Pinochet years, so definitely. They probably had a reference to that. What was their...
So my crew on the film, my co-producer, Pablo Navarrete, his parents are political exiles. His father was held in the National Stadium. His mother was arrested by Pinochet's secret police, the DINA. They went through all kinds of terrible abuse at the hands of the dictatorship. My editor, my assistant editor, who also did some footage, shot some of the footage. His father is also a Chilean political exile who was arrested and detained under Pinochet. So this film, is a very, very personal project. I was very, very conscious that as an outsider, but someone who deeply loves Chile and is deeply conscious of what happened there, that I had to pay tribute to all the things people had gone through, you know, and I had to be able to show this to people who had lived it and not like degrade the memory of what had happened. You know, I had to pay tribute to what they'd been
through. It's clearly, it's clear in your film that you have deep sensitivity for the subject and also well prepared, you know, a lot of, you know, you did your research, which is what any good documentary filmmaker.
Well, I mean, I was fortunate for having lived there.
But I can also see the feeling, you know, the feeling of really connecting, and also, what's the word I'm looking for? Resonating with the movement and with what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, I always felt, being in Chile, you know, I went on a lot of marches when I lived there. I went on a lot of protests for a lot of different regions, different movements. I went on Mapuche protests, I went on student protests, I went on the 11th of September protests, all kinds, you know. And, you know, obviously I don't, you know, I look like a foreigner, you know, but I was never, I get called that a lot there, but I was never treated, you know, people never like treat me as if I shouldn't be there. And I was always...
I'm not there too. No, I think people are surprised when they realize that Chileans are very accepting of other people and very warm and very passionate when they, you know, they'll tell you what's on their mind. Not very politically correct in many ways, and yet on the other hand, more genuine in that way.
Well, I mean, I always felt very welcome in Chile, even on political marches. You know, sometimes people would speak to me out of curiosity, so I've always felt very comfortable, which helped me to shoot this film because, you know, I could go into like the midst of something, and with a camera, and I'm quite clearly a foreigner with a camera. I mean, that's a fair reason to be suspicious, you know, of somebody, because you know, there's a lot of bad stuff happening, and you know, there's a lot of people getting harassed and.
Well, you took a lot of risks yourself.
I did, but I kind of, I don't know. When you're filming, you kind of feel like you're in a bubble, which is a bit of a probably naive way to be. But also, you know, it's a reality. When you've got a passport for a wealthier nation, then you're almost slightly protected by that, you know. Which, you know, shouldn't necessarily be the case, but I think is a reality. So yeah, I mean, I felt threatened a couple of times by the police. I never felt threatened in any other situation. I never felt threatened by the people. Sometimes people would say, stop filming. And that's completely understandable because it was, I mean, there's a lot of sensitive stuff I saw that's not in the film, you know, and a lot of the stuff that I did film, I made sure I got permission. I'd say to people, look, can I film here, you know? But then other times you're just filming because everybody's filming. Everyone's got a phone out and is filming, you know? So there's also like an element of that. But I mean, everything's been documented these days, isn't it? So yeah, I just...
your audience.
Yeah.
What particularly called their attention the most?
When people have watched it? Quite a few things, actually. I mean, obviously the police brutality is quite shocking at times, but also like the cultural aspect. Those have been commented on a lot. You know, the police, especially like when they attacked the memorial. Where the people
was brutal.
Where the guy died. I've seen very similar stuff from the 1980s in Chile. You know, the funerals in Plaza de Armas in Santiago, where there are funerals for people murdered by the dictatorship, and the police would attack those funerals as well. You know, it's something the police have done historically. So I think there's like a historical continuation. There's like an old documentary from made by ITN, actually, a British news channel, but I think was he a Chilean filmmaker? But it was produced by ITN, a British news organization, and it's called Images of a Dictatorship. And that was also an influence on me, because that is literally just a series of kind of reports from during the regime, and I think if you watch that and then watch my film, you would actually think, yeah, things haven't changed that much. You know, people aren't necessarily getting disappeared from their homes in the middle of the night. There are some exceptions, of course, you know, Macarena Valdez and Alejandro Castro and people who have died in very suspicious circumstances. But overall, in the policing of the population, I mean, yeah, it just looks very, very similar. And I remember watching those films in 2010, 2011, when I'd been going on protests and like for the first time in Chile, and thinking, wow, man, this is kind of looks very similar, because, you know, as I already said, the uniforms are the same. They're just attacking people still today for very little reason. You know, I worked and lived in central Santiago in 2011 when the student movement was happening. And I mean, you just step out of the metro station and just walk into a cloud of tear gas. You know, I even had tear gas coming into my flat one day because I lived in a place called Barrio Brazil, which, if you know Santiago, Barrio Brazil is quite a migrant, student, bohemian part of town. So it's quite like a bit of a protest hotspot. Yes. So like, they'd just be attacking, you know, people would be doing a cacerolazo, banging pots and pans, like completely peaceful, but just making some noise in the middle of a residential area, and they would just attack it with water cannon and tear gas, and they just don't care, you know, they just don't care who it hits. So a lot of what you see historically resonates today, and that's never been addressed, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much anger. And it's not only that is the case, but it's also the same people. You know, Piñera is the president. Piñera's brother was a minister under Pinochet. I spent my first months in Santiago living in Providencia, which is, for those who don't know, is a kind of more upmarket part of town. You know, wealthier. It's got like a lot of like shopping centers or malls, big apartment blocks, that kind of thing. And the mayor of that area was a guy called Christian Labé, and he himself, you know, was a former paratrooper who had been a member of what is called the Caravan of Death, which was a death squad, which went all over Chile, up and down Chile in the weeks and months after the coup, basically executing people. They were taking people out of prison. The dictatorship or the military had arrested people, put them in prison, and then you know, the Caravan of Death would come by and would just kill those people, often in the most brutal ways and horrific ways. And you know, it's documented that Christian Larrey was a soldier in that group. And then he was the mayor of Providencia, you know, one of the wealthiest parts of the country. And you know, it wasn't like he was there quietly. He had a high media profile, and he really enjoyed provoking people and being a very outspoken Pinochet supporter. So a lot of these people were not only, they hadn't faced justice, but they were in like very high positions of high profile, important positions, where they were using those positions to further their own agenda and getting wealthy as well. So those were the kind of things that really shocked me. And also going through Providencia, you had this 11th of September Avenue, which of course is the date of the coup. And you know, in like 2010, that avenue was still called 11th of September Avenue, because they changed the name to commemorate the day of the coup, like it was a date to remember, to commemorate. Since then they've changed it. They changed the name back a few years ago. It's now called Nueva Providencia, Avenida Nueva Providencia, so right. New Providencia Avenue. But I mean, that was like, they changed it like 26, 27 years after the dictatorship ended. You know, so like these are the kinds of things that those are the kinds of things I was really like, wow, man. It's like the symbols of the dictatorship.
Right,
it's celebrated. Right.
It isn't like in other countries, democracies that Chile likes to compare themselves to, where the horrors or the past are no longer applauded. And in Chile, you still have many people. Don't forget that the plebiscite to displace Pinochet was very close.
Yeah, it's very close. Yeah.
So the country has been divided for a very long time in terms of, and this is probably why we get the shift from, you know, the right wins and then the left, the socialist comes back. because there's still strong support,
No, that was clear to me as well. I'll just be cheap.
Well, the thing is that there is still this idea that Chile was saved from communism. That justifies it all. That justifies it all. Which
that's the line you often hear. Yeah.
Exactly.
But,
which, when you've transitioned to a democracy and you want to call yourself a country that is aspiring to the first world, you certainly can't have the repression that we saw in the first months of El Estallido.
Yeah.
And the fact that human rights organizations went into the country and actually stated there's human rights abuses in Chile. I think that kind of, I don't know if completely, clearly not, but things have progressed in a way where we're no longer, the atrocities of all the young people that lost an eye or both was just horrendous.
Well, just 3 days ago.
This is a method, though, that is being applied in other places of the world.
With the eyes.
Yes.
Very disturbing. I work closely with Colombia, and Colombia has also had an estallido like in April this year, very similar to what occurred in Chile. And we've seen the same issue taking place there, deliberately shooting mainly young people in the faces to blind them. And you also saw it in France with the yellow vest protest under Macron.
This is what I'm saying.
It's not only in Latin America,
It's not only Latin America.
Countries as well. It's in France. Countries like to portray themselves as the sort of, the model for the rest of the world, the democratic and stable model, the leaders. And obviously, like the US repression of the Black Lives Matter protests was just shocking as well, because just the economic system and the racism that underpins it it's been so exposed now, and people are far less willing to accept it. And we're seeing more and more brutality inflicted by states that are not prepared to address the people's demands. The people's demands for more equality, for a fairer society. They prefer to do what the police are doing in Chile, what they're doing in Colombia, what they're doing in the US and many other places. So that's Britain isn't quite at that stage, but what we're seeing in Britain is we're getting more authoritarian legislation coming in, where there's a lot of discontent here. There's a lot of corruption in the government. Inequality has been growing for a very, very long time, and COVID has made that worse. And now we're getting laws like anti-protest laws being introduced in Britain, which is protest is obviously a democratic right. To go to the streets. And now,
absolutely.
You
also have corruption, because corruption is at the heart of the disintegration of all governments and societies everywhere. That is the factor that makes it impossible to really build anything when you have corruption rampant. And I would have thought Great Britain was one of the few that supposedly didn't have that much corruption. But
the thing is, Britain has a every time I talk to people about this, they're kind of surprised. Britain has like a very has somehow managed to produce an image.
You have an image of
well, I'll tell you what, in COVID our government was giving these contracts to £1 billion, or millions and millions of pounds worth of contracts for protective equipment to companies which had no record of it, provided nothing, because the owners of these companies were party supporters. But here the thing is, a lot of it's built into the system. Our political system is like 1,000 years old, so our political establishment, it's a very, very old system here. So a lot of that is built into the system. So it's not like illegal corruption, it's like legal corruption, if you know what I mean.
Right.
You can join the nobility.
Nick, can I take 1 second, please? Excuse me.
Yeah, I'm going to take a second as well.
Yeah. No, maybe we should wrap it up. It's a wonderful conversation. And I know it's late back there where you are, and I'm sure you haven't stopped getting a lot of calls and to participate in this sort of Zoom recording. But I want to thank you, Nick.
You're welcome.
For your time, and SantiagoRisingFilm.com. That is where people can.
Yeah. And I'm also, it's at alborada.net. Because Alborada Films is the film's production company, but alborada.net is a kind of news and culture website focused on Latin America, publishing in English, because we want people who maybe don't speak Spanish or who aren't as familiar with it to engage, because there's not enough coverage on Latin America here. So that's kind of one of the things we aim to do.
Well, the Bay Area, there are many, many, many Chileans in this area.
I can't wait to go there. I've never been, so
yes, please let me know if you're going to come and visit for sure.
Yeah,
and let's see if we can get. I'm going to talk to Luis that produces the Cine+Mas Latino Film Festival.
Yeah.
Because maybe we could later down, we could have a showing here.
That would be fantastic.
I would be happy to organize that, because there are many, many Chileans here that are this is a very sensitive subject. They were exiled. They're in Berkeley.
Sure.
Universities. There's different generations, and the ties between California and Chile go back to the gold rush.
Yeah, sure.
But
I'd be delighted to come out. Yeah, I'll try and come. I'd love to go and organize a bunch of screenings in the US and go.
Well, if you can come, and that would be fantastic. So we'll continue the conversation. And
let's just see how the world of travel, how travel is over the next few months, and then
so that we can show your film when you're here. That would be fabulous.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to send you the video of this interview then, Paula, and we can.
All right.
Speak later.
All right. We'll stay in touch for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for your time.
No, thank you.
See you later. Hasta luego.
See you soon. Ciao.